Hi, I'm Tam Baillie, Scotland's Commissioner for Children and Young People, and I'm sorry I can't be with you today, and I would have been delighted to be there with you today because I was there in the launch of the Go Play programme in 2009. And I want to give you some of my own experience, if you like, some of my own reflections, and it's my own childhood. I spent the first 6 years of my life living in Bridgeton, and in those days we played in the back courts. I won't try and describe the back courts to you, but if there was a risk assessment done on them nowadays, then people would be a bit scared. But one of the things that we used to play was Cowboys and Indians. Cowboys and Indians through John Wayne films, and we had great fun. In fact, we used to make tomahawks which were made with a piece of stick about this length and a tin can that was bashed into the top of the stick, and we would then run about. Some people would say nowadays we run about wild, playing with these tin cans, these tomahawks, and I'm sure that there would be a different reaction nowadays to children, groups of children, playing with toys which had so much potential for violent behaviour, but it was in our imagination. And that's what we need to recapture, is that sense of children enjoying their play and not be too hung up about the risk factors that are in that. As long as we're sensible about it, then I think that we can actually have a different approach to a risk-averse culture. I want to give you a little bit of information about some of the work that we've been doing, that I've been doing. Previously, information came to light about the kind of misconceptions and myths that had been built up around children in care and the kind of risks that were acceptable or not. For instance, when children are out playing with their bike, the kind of risk assessment that had to be done, the child had to go out in some instances with all sorts of protective padding on their elbows and on their knees, signing forms of exactly where they went, and taking a bicycle repair kit and a declaration of when they would return. Now I can understand that if it was a long trip, but if this is just a child who's going on a cycle trip to the shops, then it's taken things a little bit far. And in fact, the other instances where children were being taken on trips to, for instance, Arran, and the members of staff had to carry a throw rope just in case the children went near the water. So we produced a publication just last year. We called it Go Outdoors, and really that's about trying to encourage our staff who are working with children in care to be prepared to take some risks which under normal circumstances they would take in any case. I want to give you a quote from that publication. In fact, it comes from somebody who's in the health and safety executive, and what they said was, I'll need to read this, they said, "There's a tendency in some sectors to take exactly the same approach to trips as they would to running a factory, doing complicated formulaic sums rather than asking the simple question, is this risk acceptable or unacceptable?" And just another bit about my own activity. I will talk about Go Play, promise, but another bit about my own activity is that I've recently been conducting what has turned out to be the biggest consultation ever with children in Scotland. We called it a right blether, and we got 74,000 responses. But the reason I tell you that is that the follow-up to that is a right wee blether, and that's going to be conducted with children who are aged 2 to 5. And we are calling, and we know that that's going to be a creative conversation with children, and the part that play forms in that is central, because we know that in communicating with children and getting responses from them and getting their preferences and assisting them to interact with the world, that play is absolutely at the centre of how we get to our youngest children. In regards to Go Play, I just want to give a few reflections on what's been happening over the last 2 years. It's a relatively modest fund in terms of the overall funding for children, but the funders and yourselves have managed to do a lot with that, because there's evidence, for instance, of funding for infrastructure in terms of some of our national organisations, as well as funding for for smaller projects that are much more targeted on local areas. There's also evidence of funding for what we've traditionally seen as adventure type activities, as well as trying to foster a different approach in traditional playground areas or school playgrounds. And there's also, as you would expect, been a spread right across the country of trying to impact on many areas of the country. So I'm looking forward to the challenge that's presented in terms of evaluating that number of projects, but also I know that the intention of the evaluation is to have a much more significant impact than just in the individual projects, but in terms of our national approach to play and the place that it fulfills in terms of the development of our children. And in terms of looking forward, I have to say that I'm in an optimistic outlook here. We've already had our previous administration do a good job in terms of publishing the evidence for early years, in terms of promoting more and better services in the early years, even if it didn't go so far as to have, in my view, sufficient levers of change in place, but I think they're going to be looking at that. We've already had that backed up by some action, for instance, play, talk, read, which complements a lot of the stuff that's been happening under Go Play. We know that the government has already allocated an early years fund, which has been administered by Inspiirng Scotland, and indeed behind that there's manifesto commitments for 50 million in terms of early years. But the key thing for me is that the government are looking at legislation, the potential for legislation on early years, which I think will help complement what's in the early years framework. And I'm pleased that they're taking a measured approach to that to make sure that the legislation hits the mark. And I think that a lot of the activity that's taking place under Go Play, and particularly if the evaluation highlights the lessons that can be learned in terms of the funding stream that's already been in existence for 2 years, then that can have an influence on the kind of approach that we take to legislation. So in all of that, I'm optimistic. I'm also aware that the UN have prompted or are planning a general comment on Article 31. Article 31, which is a child's right to play, and all of that is pointing in the right direction, pointing in the same direction in which we want to go in Scotland, which is to much better early years provision, and play has got a very significant role to play in all of that.